Have you ever noticed that some people don't walk away from relationships believing it's actually the end? They leave expecting a reaction. They expect you to chase them, to panic, to reach out in desperation. They assume silence will be followed by emotional pursuit, that you will flood them with messages, regret, and attempts to fix what's breaking. But when none of that happens, they are often caught off guard. What unsettles them most is not the distance itself, but the absence of the reaction they were relying on. Because deep down, they were not prepared for the possibility that you might simply accept their departure and continue forward without trying to pull them back. That moment disrupts everything they thought they understood about control and emotional influence in the relationship. Many people assume that when a narcissistic individual ends a relationship, it means they are completely finished with it. However, that is not always the case. In some situations, leaving is not about closure, but about experimentation. It becomes a way to test influence, to see whether they still hold emotional leverage over the other person. Within these dynamics, relationships are often shaped by imbalance, where one person gradually becomes accustomed to receiving validation, attention, or reassurance on demand. When tension arises, instead of direct communication, they may withdraw affection, become distant, or emotionally unavailable. This behavior is not always intended to end the connection, but to provoke a predictable emotional response that confirms their importance and control within the relationship structure. Over time, this pattern becomes reinforced, especially when the other person responds with urgency or emotional distress. Each message sent in panic, each apology made to prevent abandonment, and each attempt to repair a situation that was not entirely their fault reinforces the belief that emotional outcomes can be directed or controlled. The focus gradually shifts away from resolving the actual issue and moves toward the reassurance that comes from being pursued. In this sense, the chase itself becomes more rewarding than any resolution. It confirms that attention and emotional investment are still available on demand. For the person exhibiting these behaviors, this dynamic can serve as a steady source of validation, temporarily easing internal insecurity and strengthening their perceived sense of importance within the relationship. Beneath this surface behavior, there is often a more fragile sense of self-worth that depends heavily on external reassurance. Instead of being anchored internally, their confidence may fluctuate based on how others respond to them in moments of distance or conflict. When someone pursues them, it temporarily stabilizes that insecurity and reinforces the identity they are trying to maintain. Over time, this can create an expectation that pursuit is not something that might happen, but something that is guaranteed. They begin to assume that withdrawing will automatically draw others back in, restoring their sense of importance. When silence replaces the expected reaction, it disrupts the pattern they have come to rely on. Without the anticipated response, the entire emotional script breaks down, revealing a dynamic that continues to repeat itself in many relationships without ever being fully recognized or addressed. When someone with narcissistic patterns pulls away in a relationship, it often follows a recognizable pattern. They may become distant, cold, stop responding to messages, pick unnecessary conflicts, or suddenly withdraw attention without explanation. Internally, these behaviors are usually meant to provoke a reaction from the other person. They expect confusion, anxiety, and urgency that leads the other person to chase, ask questions, apologize, or quickly try to restore the connection. That response reinforces their sense of importance and emotional influence. But when that reaction doesn't happen, the pattern breaks down. The silence is no longer followed by pursuit. There are no desperate messages, no repeated calls, no emotional escalation. Instead, they are met with calm absence. And that creates uncertainty because the response they were relying on simply never arrives. Silence becomes unsettling in this context because it removes the validation they were anticipating. The emotional feedback loop they depended on suddenly stops working, leaving them without the reassurance they are used to receiving through reaction. Without someone emotionally engaging, the sense of control they gained from triggering responses disappears. What was expected to create leverage produces nothing instead, and that shift can feel disorienting. Attention is no longer being pulled back toward them, and instead there is just stillness. At its core, these dynamics are not really about emotional closeness or mutual understanding. They are more often centered around influence, positioning, and control over how another person responds. Even when language like love or commitment is used, the underlying structure is frequently about directing emotional outcomes rather than sharing them. This need for control can also show up in subtle, everyday behaviors, such as deciding when communication should happen, establishing emotional expectations that only the other person must follow, or creating situations where reassurance becomes something the other person feels forced to provide. Over time, this creates an uneven dynamic where one person adjusts and accommodates while the other quietly directs the emotional tone of the relationship. Independence begins to feel threatening to this pattern because it removes predictability. When the other person stops over-explaining, stops chasing, or stops reacting emotionally, the usual system stops functioning. What is lost is not just compliance, but the ability to predict outcomes. That uncertainty disrupts the position they had built, and the absence of pursuit becomes a reflection they can no longer avoid, because it removes the emotional response that once sustained the cycle. In many narcissistic dynamics, constant attention, reactions, and emotional energy from others work like distraction. As long as someone is chasing them, trying to repair the relationship, or staying focused on their needs, it helps reinforce a constructed belief about being important, desirable. The responses they receive become proof that they are central in someone else's emotional world. When you step back and stop participating in that cycle, the reflection they depended on starts to fade. The image they relied on becomes less stable because it is no longer being reinforced by your effort, sacrifice, or pursuit. Without that engagement, external validation decreases, and the identity built around it feels less supported. It also removes a convenient outlet for blame. When you are not there to argue, defend yourself, or absorb criticism, the usual pattern weakens, leaving more space for reflection and reduced distraction from their own behavior. If this message resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe, like the video, and share your experience in the comments. Your story may help someone else recognize a pattern they have been struggling to understand. In many narcissistic dynamics, emotional distance is used as a waiting game. Rather than communicating directly, a narcissistic individual may withdraw, delay responses, act indifferent, or become emotionally unavailable. This creates uncertainty, and that uncertainty naturally pulls the other person into overthinking and seeking clarity. As attention shifts toward repairing the connection, the emotional focus becomes centered on the person creating distance. The strategy works because it encourages pursuit without direct requests. The waiting game also allows them to measure how much influence they still have, observing whether the other person reacts, follows, or becomes emotionally distressed in response to silence and withdrawal. Each attempt to reconnect, whether through messages, calls, or emotional gestures, becomes a way of measuring influence rather than resolving conflict. In this dynamic, silence is not neutral. It is interpreted as data. The more the other person reaches out, the stronger the belief becomes that emotional control is still intact. This creates a cycle where attention is not actively demanded, but indirectly drawn through uncertainty. Over time, the focus shifts away from genuine resolution and toward testing how far emotional pull extends. The narcissistic individual often gains reassurance not from solving issues, but from seeing evidence that they can still affect someone's emotional state. The relationship becomes less about mutual understanding and more about observing reactions, dependency, and responsiveness. In this sense, emotional distance is not just withdrawal, but a tool used to maintain a sense of position, relevance, and influence within the relationship structure. Self-respect changes the dynamic because it shifts how a person responds to manipulation, pressure, and emotional uncertainty. In many narcissistic relationships, unhealthy patterns continue because one person repeatedly sacrifices their own needs in order to maintain connection. They tolerate disrespect, excuse harmful behavior, and take responsibility for issues they did not create. Over time, this creates an imbalance where compliance becomes expected and emotional boundaries weaken. When self-respect grows, this pattern begins to break. A person starts recognizing their own needs as equally important and becomes less willing to chase someone who withdraws, ignores, or destabilizes the relationship. They stop over-explaining, stop accepting blame that is not theirs, and stop adjusting their behavior to maintain peace at any cost. Instead, decisions are guided by personal values rather than fear of loss, allowing clarity and emotional independence to replace constant anxiety and uncertainty within the relationship. This change often looks small from the outside, but over time, it can completely reshape the dynamic. The narcissist may struggle to understand it because the reactions they once depended on are no longer predictable. What used to trigger immediate emotional responses no longer has the same effect. Silent treatment, guilt, or attempts to create emotional pressure stop producing compliance the way they used to. Instead of reacting on impulse, the person starts filtering everything through self-worth, emotional awareness, and long-term stability. As self-respect grows stronger, emotional dependency naturally fades. The relationship is no longer viewed as the only source of validation or security. This creates a quiet but powerful shift in balance, where the focus moves away from maintaining the connection at any cost and shifts toward protecting personal boundaries, integrity, and emotional well-being. This psychological shift can also lead to what is often called a narcissistic injury. It happens when the internal image someone has carefully built about themselves is suddenly challenged by reality. That image is often based on being important, desired, or emotionally influential. When the expected reactions no longer appear, the person is faced with something they did not anticipate. The withdrawal is not met with pursuit, and the silence is not filled with emotional chasing. Instead, there is distance and calm. This feels unsettling because it clashes with the story they have been relying on. The response is often less about the relationship itself and more about the disruption of perceived influence. Reactions may include anger, blame, defensiveness, or sudden efforts to reestablish contact, all rooted in the need to restore the validation that once supported their sense of control and significance. Indifference is often more powerful than revenge because revenge keeps a person emotionally tied to the very situation they are trying to escape. After being hurt, it is natural to feel anger and a desire for justice or emotional payback. Many people imagine confrontation or exposure as a form of resolution, but even then, the focus is still on the other person. Energy, attention, and emotional space remain occupied. Indifference works differently. It is not denial or suppression, but a gradual removal of emotional importance. The narcissist's opinions, reactions, and approval no longer hold weight. Focus slowly shifts toward healing, rebuilding, and personal growth. Without emotional engagement to feed on, their ability to influence mood or self-worth fades because there is nothing left to trigger a response. This realization marks a turning point where a person begins to take back ownership of their emotional life. Decisions are no longer shaped by fear, approval seeking, or the hope of being validated by someone else. Instead, they are guided by clarity, self-respect, and emotional strength. The narcissist may never fully understand why the chasing stopped, often interpreting it through their own assumptions. But the goal was never to control their understanding. It was to restore internal balance and self-worth. Every moment of restraint, every boundary maintained, and every step away from the cycle reflects a quiet commitment to peace over validation. The real shift is not about winning or losing someone else, but about recognizing wholeness within yourself. Sometimes the most life-changing moment is not victory over another person, but the moment you begin finally choosing yourself. What often gets overlooked in these dynamics is how gradual the shift actually is. It rarely feels like a dramatic decision in the moment. More often, it starts when someone becomes emotionally tired of the same cycle repeating itself. The explanations stop feeling useful. The arguments stop feeling meaningful. Even the urge to fix things begins to fade. What replaces it is not anger, but clarity, a quiet awareness that no matter how much effort is given, the pattern resets itself. At that point, the emotional system that once kept the connection alive starts to weaken because it was powered largely by reaction, engagement, and hope. When those elements are reduced, the structure of the relationship naturally begins to change, even if nothing is said out loud. From the other side, this change can feel confusing because it removes predictability. When someone is no longer emotionally reactive, they are no longer easy to read or influence in the same way. Attempts to recreate the old dynamic may still happen, but they often produce weaker results over time. What used to trigger urgency or emotional escalation no longer lands the same way. This creates a kind of mismatch between expectation and reality. The more the old strategies fail, the more unstable the interaction becomes because it is no longer operating on familiar emotional rules. Eventually, what remains is either adaptation or withdrawal, depending on whether the pattern can be replaced with something healthier. At the same time, the person who has stepped back often goes through their own internal adjustment. Distance does not automatically mean immediate peace. There can still be reflection, doubt, and moments of emotional pull toward what felt familiar. But over time, those impulses lose strength when they are not reinforced by ongoing engagement. Each time the urge to re-enter the cycle is resisted, the nervous system begins to settle into a new baseline. Life starts to feel less like emotional management and more like personal direction. The focus shifts from monitoring someone else's reactions to rebuilding internal stability. What makes this shift so significant is that it changes the source of emotional authority. Instead of looking outward for validation, reassurance, or clarity, the person begins relying more on internal standards. That does not mean becoming cold or detached, but becoming selective about where emotional energy is invested. Relationships stop being measured by intensity and start being measured by consistency, respect, and reciprocity. And once that internal shift takes hold, returning to older dynamics becomes increasingly unlikely, not because of resistance, but because they no longer align with how the person understands themselves. Another important layer in this topic is how the push and pull dynamic trains both people in the relationship without them fully realizing it. When one person repeatedly withdraws and the other repeatedly pursues, it slowly builds a kind of emotional conditioning. The withdrawing behavior creates tension, and the pursuit temporarily relieves it. Over time, the nervous system starts to associate discomfort with distance and relief with chasing. That is why these patterns can feel so intense and hard to break, even when someone logically understands they are unhealthy. But when the pursuit stops, that conditioning loses its reinforcement. The emotional alarm system that used to activate around silence or distance begins to lose its certainty. Instead of immediately reacting, the person starts noticing a gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, something new becomes possible: choice. Rather than reacting automatically, there is a brief space to evaluate what is actually happening versus what is being felt. That space is where change begins, because it interrupts the old programming. From a psychological standpoint, a lot of the power in these dynamics comes from uncertainty rather than direct action. Uncertainty keeps attention locked in. The mind tries to resolve it by thinking more, analyzing more, and emotionally investing more energy. When clarity starts replacing uncertainty, the emotional grip weakens. This is why consistency and predictability can feel so stabilizing after chaos. The system no longer needs to stay on alert because there is nothing unclear to decode. On the other side, when someone is used to being the center of emotional attention, reduced reaction can feel like invisibility, not because they are actually invisible, but because the feedback loop they relied on is no longer active. That shift can be uncomfortable, especially if identity or self-worth has been strongly tied to being needed, pursued, or emotionally prioritized. The absence of reaction removes the confirmation they were accustomed to receiving, and that can force a confrontation with discomfort that was previously avoided. But the deeper transformation always happens in the person who stops participating in the cycle. As emotional reactivity decreases, so does the sense of being pulled into constant relational tension. Life begins to feel less like managing someone else's behavior and more like focusing on one's own direction. And slowly, the emotional importance of the old pattern fades, not through effort to forget, but through lack of reinforcement. Eventually, What once felt urgent starts to feel distant, not because the memory disappears, but because it no longer shapes daily emotional reality. That is usually the point where real detachment forms, and the cycle loses its ability to restart in the same way. What also becomes clearer over time is that these patterns are rarely just about one person being the controller and the other being the pursuer. In most cases, the dynamic is co-created, even if it feels uneven. One person may lean toward withdrawal, emotional unpredictability, or control through distance, while the other leans toward repair, explanation, and emotional persistence. Together, that creates a loop where each person's behavior reinforces the other's. The cycle continues not just because of intention, but because each response unintentionally validates the other person's strategy. When that loop is broken, it can feel disorienting for both sides. The person who used to react starts to feel less emotionally activated, and the person who used to trigger reactions no longer gets the same feedback. This is where many misunderstandings happen. Silence gets interpreted as punishment, indifference, or strategy, when in reality it is often just disengagement from an exhausting pattern. What disappears is not love or emotion itself, but the automatic participation in a cycle that was running on habit rather than conscious choice. A key turning point is when emotional self-regulation becomes stronger than emotional reaction. Instead of responding immediately to anxiety, fear, or longing, a person begins to observe those feelings without acting on them. That shift changes everything because it interrupts the speed of the cycle. These dynamics survive on quick reactions, quick messages, quick apologies, quick returns. Slowing that down weakens the structure. It introduces reflection where there used to be impulse. Over time, the emotional intensity that once defined the connection starts to lose its grip, not because the feelings disappear overnight, but because they are no longer constantly reinforced. The brain stops receiving the same signals that used to keep the cycle alive. And without reinforcement, even strong emotional patterns begin to fade into the background. Eventually, what remains is perspective. The relationship is no longer experienced through urgency, fear, or emotional dependency, but through distance and clarity. And in that clarity, it becomes easier to see whether the connection was built on mutual respect or on repeated emotional imbalance. That realization alone is often what finally closes the loop. As this process continues, one of the most noticeable changes is how differently time feels inside the dynamic. When someone is emotionally entangled in the cycle, even short periods of silence can feel heavy, stretched, and loaded with meaning. Every delay is analyzed. Every shift in tone is interpreted. The mind stays active because it is trying to regain certainty. But as emotional dependency weakens, time begins to feel less charged. Silence becomes just silence, not a message to decode. Distance becomes absence, not a signal of loss or urgency. This shift also changes how communication is experienced. Instead of words carrying intense emotional weight, they start to lose their ability to destabilize. A message that once would have triggered panic or overthinking begins to feel neutral. That does not mean the person stops caring. It means their nervous system is no longer reacting as if every interaction is a turning point. Emotional neutrality gradually replaces emotional reactivity, and that is what creates stability. At the same time, the need to seek closure from the other person often starts to fade. In earlier stages, there is usually a strong desire for explanation, accountability, or resolution. The mind wants a clear ending, something that makes sense of the emotional experience. And in that distance, the person finally begins to experience a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on someone else's behavior, but on their own internal consistency. Another shift that often happens at this stage is the change in how emotional hooks are perceived. In the earlier phases of a toxic or imbalanced dynamic, certain behaviors carry a lot of emotional leverage: withdrawal, silence, sudden affection, or unpredictability. These create spikes in emotion that keep the mind engaged and searching for meaning. But as detachment grows, those same behaviors lose their sharpness. They are still noticed, but they no longer dictate internal emotional states in the same way. What used to feel like urgency begins to feel like repetition. The same patterns appear again, but without the same psychological impact. This is because the brain gradually stops assigning high importance to signals that no longer lead to meaningful or stable outcomes. When emotional responses are no longer consistently rewarded with clarity, resolution, or security, the intensity naturally declines. The system begins to conserve energy instead of constantly activating. At this point, many people also start recognizing how much of their earlier emotional investment was driven by anticipation rather than reality. A large part of the cycle is built on waiting for change, waiting for consistency, waiting for understanding, waiting for the other person to become different. When that waiting stops, the emotional structure collapses in a quiet way. Not dramatically, but through absence of expectation. And once a person experiences relationships without that constant internal noise, it becomes difficult to return to dynamics that rely on instability to feel meaningful. The standard changes. What once felt emotionally intense may start to feel unnecessary or even draining. That change is not forced. It develops naturally as the mind learns what steadiness actually feels like. Another important layer that often gets missed is how much of this shift is actually internal rather than external. From the outside, the situation may look the same. The same person, the same silence, the same distance, the same communication patterns. But internally, the meaning of all of it changes completely. What used to be interpreted as danger or emotional urgency starts to register as information without emotional demand attached to it. That change in interpretation is what quietly transforms the entire experience. At the beginning of these dynamics, the nervous system is highly reactive. Small changes in tone, timing, or attention can feel significant because they are tied to emotional security. But as someone begins to detach, those same signals lose their emotional charge. The body stops reacting as if every shift is a potential loss. Instead, there is a growing sense of steadiness, where reactions are replaced by observation. This doesn't happen all at once, but through repeated moments where nothing catastrophic follows silence or distance, and the mind slowly learns that it doesn't need to stay on alert. Over time, this creates a new internal baseline. Instead of emotional highs and lows being triggered by another person's behavior, the emotional system begins to stabilize around self-generated clarity. That doesn't mean emotions disappear, but they stop being controlled by external unpredictability. This is one of the key differences between emotional dependency and emotional independence. Whether your internal world is being constantly rewritten by someone else's actions, or whether it remains anchored even when external conditions shift, as this anchoring develops, the desire to re-enter old cycles weakens naturally. Not because of discipline or suppression, but because the emotional payoff is no longer there. The same patterns that once created intensity now feel unnecessary or repetitive. And when something no longer produces the same internal response, the mind gradually stops investing in it. Eventually, what remains is a quieter kind of awareness. The relationship is no longer experienced through emotional urgency, but through clarity and distance. And in that clarity, it becomes easier to see that stability was never something the other person had to provide. It was something that began forming the moment attention stopped being fully surrendered to instability.